Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3. It's hard to believe, but it's already day 3 of Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting, Bulgaria's first podcast festival. So far, we've met some amazing storytellers who took us along with them on a journey behind the scenes of some great podcasts like Radiolab and Rough Translation. We also talk about the rise of news podcasts, and today it's gonna be all about investigative journalism, because in increasingly investigative journalists choose audio to tell investigative stories. And we had some amazing speakers tonight that I'll introduce to you in just a second. But before that, some housekeeping tips. You can ask your questions to our speakers using the Q&A section in this webinar. So please feel free to ask away, and we'll have time to answer them at the end of the session. For those of you who are watching us on Facebook and YouTube, you can ask your questions in the comment section below. And for those of you who like to share some insights about the festival or the speakers on social media, please use the hashtags podcast festival and listen up. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, or maybe Friday afternoon, depending on the country that you are. And it's an incredible pleasure to introduce to you Maeve McClenaghan. She is an award-winning journalist based in the UK. She is also working with the Center of Investigative Journalism, and she's done some amazing work investigating homelessness in the United Kingdom, as well as domestic violence. Last but not least, she's also the creator and host of the Tip-Off. If you haven't heard of the Tip-Off, you should definitely have a listen after we're done here, but you'll have a chance to hear about it as well later tonight. So hello, Maeve, and welcome.
Sorry, classic Zoom. Mute. How many times has that happened in the festival? But thanks so much.
It's the world we live in, so.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, take it away.
Fantastic. So in this session, we're going to be hearing a lot about Daphne Caruana Galizia, an amazing investigative journalist from Malta. Daphne, as many of you probably already know, was doing groundbreaking work before her untimely death. She created a blog called Running Commentary, and she seemed to be fearless. She would call out businessmen, corruption, politicians, whoever it might be in Malta. And she rattled a lot of cages, and she pissed off a lot of people, as all good investigative journalists should. And Daphne paid the highest price for her incredible work. In October 2017, she was killed when a car bomb detonated under her car. So we're going to hear a little later on from her son, Paul, about how he created an amazing podcast called My Mother's Murder. But first, we're going to listen to Jules Giraud-Dat, who is the deputy editor of Forbidden Stories, to hear a little bit about how Daphne's work has continued on past her death, and how investigative journalists all around the world have decided they're not going to let her killers win. They're going to keep going and make sure that the things that she was digging into are exposed. So Jules, thank you for being here.
Hello, Maeve. Hello, Boriana, and hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation.
So maybe, Jules, could you start by telling us briefly, what is Forbidden Stories? What is it that you guys do?
Yes, Forbidden Stories, it's a consortium, a group of international investigative journalists. We are currently 45 journalists from 30 media outlets such as The Guardian, The Washington Post, Le Monde, or Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany. And the idea is when a journalist is killed, we try to start to investigate the death of this journalist and to continue his work, to try to expose it as broadly as possible. And the idea is to, most of the time when journalists are killed, they are very isolated. They don't necessarily belong to a major news organization. That was the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. They have received threats for many months, many years. And so at the end, they are easy target. And the goal of the people that kill journalists is to silence them, to silence their source stories, and to make sure that citizens don't hear or don't read this very important issue of public interest. And our idea is to collaborate, retrieve the work of these journalists, work together, investigate as far as possible, ask questions to the people responsible, and to publish all together at the same time to get as much impact as possible.
So can you tell us how and why you came across Daphne's work particularly? What was the decision making there, and that would be one of the cases that you took on?
Actually, Forbidden Stories was launched in October 2017, the same month when Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed. Many journalists of our consortium were participating to the Panama Papers. Maeve Caruana Galizia, was a member of the ICIJ. I was working in the same office as him, for instance, for a few months in Paris. So, many journalists from the group knew Maeve, knew the work of Daphne, knew the publication she made and the impact it had in Malta. So, there was a spontaneous reaction saying we have to do something, we have to react, we have to work together, we have to show that, we can't let this killing like that, and we have to continue. And it's how the project started in late October 2017, and until today we are still all working together.
And so where do you start when you take up the work of Daphne? She had a lifetime of digging into things. She knew, as Paul describes in his podcast, Malta is quite a small, close-knit society. Everyone seems to know each other. She seemed to know, Maltese politics and business links intimately. So how do you, as journalists, taking that on from the outside, where do you start? And I guess we should say, there was this suggestion that Daphne was killed not necessarily for stories that she had done because they had already come out. It's almost too late to, it wasn't necessarily an act of retribution. The suggestion was she was killed because of what she was getting towards, what she was about to publish. So where do you start when you try and take on the work of something like that?
First of all, we started to meet and talk with Paul, Matthew, and Andrew, the three sons of Daphne, because you have heard the podcast of Paul, and you're going to talk with him later. But they were perhaps the three person in Malta that, with their mother, that knew the best, what is going on, the corruption, the endemic corruption, they had everything in mind. And first of all, we needed, their approval for starting this project. Then to put in place some rules to, at the same time protect them, and at the same time not, jeopardize the investigation. But first of all, we spent, I remember, meetings in London or in Paris, and for hours, I was, myself, I didn't know pretty much anything about Malta, in Paris, you have like posters that invite you to go for holidays in Malta in the metro, but that's it. So, it was very shocking and to hear, all these stories, all these leads. And at the same time, we got access to some documents she was working on, some elements, of her mobile phone or things like that. And, that was our base. And the first thing was to read her blog. There were thousands of articles and posts. Daphne was almost a newsroom by itself, by herself. Sorry, she was writing 2 or 3 posts a day and was investigating so many leads. So we had to evaluate the different leads, then to choose on which one we're going to focus. That will be the most, the most sensitive ones, and that could maybe, maybe the the motive of her assassination. And then we all met in Paris with all the 45 journalists, and we started to share the work and to split. And that's how we started, actually.
So you're almost doing two investigations. You're investigating,
yes.
What it was she was looking into, but you're also trying to kind of put together the cryptic clues of, because as I understand it, Daphne's blog could be quite cryptic sometimes. She might allude to things without laying out exactly what it was she knew. So you're kind of trying to read between the lines and investigate her thought process as much as digging as well.
Yes, and I mean, there are two lines of investigation. It's investigating her murder and trying to find the killers and the masterminds, and then you have to continue the work, because that's our goal. It's they didn't win. They killed the messenger, but not the message. That's the dynamic. But then investigating her leads of investigation give us clues or who might have an interest in killing her, so I think both work together. And yes, sorry, your second question was?
Yeah, well, just that you were trying to kind of read between the lines of her blog posts.
Yeah, I mean, I've never met Daphne, but from what I've read and the people I talked to and that were close to her, and even citizens in Malta, because everyone knows her in Malta. Everyone called her Daphne. You say Daphne in the street, everyone knows who you're talking about. And I think it was the case before she was killed. I mean, she could be tough on people, and she can call people crook if she wants to. But she was, that was her way to work. And at the same time, she was an amazing investigator, and she maybe made some mistakes, but as every journalist, but most of her work, she was true on everything. And when we see that at the end, the government collapsed, she was true on everything. And that's quite amazing. When you're alone, when you're in a major newspaper, you have fact checkers, you have lawyers, you have colleagues, you have editor-in-chief, you have many ways to fact check your investigation. She was alone at the end. So I think one of the first things we did was trying to meet her sources, because it's, the people who were taking the risk with Daphne and that had information to reveal. The problem is when we arrived in Malta, in a few weeks after she was killed, people were scared because the message that was sent by killing her with, killing her in a car bomb, it's really a message that is sent. People were really afraid, and people say, okay, am I the next one? They were not confident in the independence of the police, so they were wondering, if they will get access to, I don't know, her messages, her notes, and will come to them. So that was the trickiest point at the beginning.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, how do you go about when you don't have contacts? You don't have the phone numbers in your phone of all of the people that she did, but because you had access to some of her documents and things, you could follow those trails. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we realized quickly, and thanks to Paul, Matthew, and Andrew, they helped us a lot, giving us contacts. Like for instance, Matthew was working a lot with her mother. They were collaborating. So we had some ideas of who is who. We got some contacts, and then the idea is that's why it's great to be a group. Is two people will go, I don't know, on October, and then two people will go on December, and then two other people. And so the idea was to be constantly present on the field, and so that people know that we are always here, that they can meet us, that they can be in confidence. You can't create a connection with someone in 2 hours. You have to come back and show. And I think it's how that worked, and how perhaps we managed to reveal some information at the end.
Was the language barrier an issue in that? Were journalists talking English, or how did you?
I mean, luckily in the group, people have a better English than mine, so that was fine. No, I mean, most of the people in Malta speak English. Then, part of the population only speak Maltese. But luckily, we were working with Jacob Borg, with a Maltese journalist from the Time of Malta. So when it was too complicated with the language, he was coming with us. That's why it's interesting to collaborate.
And so before the ICIJ really forged this path with collaboration on such a scale, investigative journalism was often seen as quite a solitary pursuit, and almost a competitive pursuit. You didn't want to tell anyone about what you were doing. You didn't want to get scooped by anyone. You certainly weren't going to go and talk to a fellow competitor about what it was you were working on. Tell us about how you coordinated a group of journalists on this, and how you do that practically. I presume it isn't people just emailing each other with sensitive information, but also how you get buy-in and trust from everyone that they're all working for the same goal.
I think you have the answer in your question. Is really it's thanks really to the work of the ICIJ that I think why Forbidden Stories managed to work so well. Laurent Richard had this amazing idea to create Forbidden Stories, but then of course there were major collaborative projects before us, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and I think it's thanks to that we started to work with, we created our group of journalists, but many of them had already worked together on previous projects. So the trust was already there. Then new people arrived and came, but, the start of it was good. And, one of the director of Forbidden Stories is Bastian Obermeier, who is one of the two journalists that, broke the Panama Papers. And so, it's Bastian and others are journalists that know how to collaborate, like Juliette Garside from the Guardian. They know how to collaborate. So I think that was quite easy. And the second thing is, when a journalist is killed and you continue her work or his work, I think it's in a sense chilling everyone down, kind of. You're here for a very important cause, so you will not start to, I don't know, hide information to your colleague, or really the goal is to go as far as possible. And as well, we think that it's collaborating protects the people on the field and protect us as well, because it doesn't make sense to kill one journalist if there are 44 that know everything that he knew and will continue the work. So and yes, I think that collaboration is perhaps the best answer today, is when we know in the area of fake news and how journalism and journalists are pointed by politicians and all that. I think the best answer is to say, look, we are not competitors, we're collaborating for the good cause, to bring the best information to the public.
And presumably it mitigates the legal risk as well. If one jurisdiction is particularly likely to sue, does it help in that way?
I mean, of course, when you start to investigate, on a government of a country or on private companies, foreign governments, private banks, of course, you have legal issues. They have the best lawyers, they have the money, they have the power. So if you collaborate, you can fact check the information together. So of course, you're more powerful. Then there is the trust is very central in our project, because let's say there is a journalist of Le Monde that is doing an interview with a source. The journalist of The Guardian will not meet the source necessarily for security issues. So you need to trust really, your partner. So that's very important. And then the idea as well is that when journalists got killed, it's true in the case of Daphne, but in many other countries where we went to these past years, most of the time they are in front of very powerful people, prime ministers, director of multinationals, and so the balance of power, it's not fair at all. And the idea is to inverse that a bit. And when, of course, we send an interview request on behalf of 30 media outlets. You know, the company said, "Oh, I might need to answer at that time." It's easier that you know, just one newspaper.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you put the fear of God in everyone that gets that email. You mentioned earlier as well that, you know, there's an ongoing legal process in trying to prosecute the alleged killers of Daphne, and that you had to be sensitive to that in your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigate that so that you don't compromise any kind of legal justice there?
I mean, I think our goal is to, you know, there is a legal procedure that is going on. Our role is to question it sometime. Is it, you know, is the justice working independently? Is the police independent? Is there any interference with, you know, the executive? So that's our work. And then I think the best way to push the authorities to do their job is to investigate ourselves and you know, to publish evidence, proofs, and that, you know, put the pressure on the justice system to react. You know, if there is any problem, if an interference, is the best way. So then, of course, our goal is not to jeopardize the legal procedure, and, you know, it's two different things. But our goal is to just to put the pressure and to be sure that this legal procedure is working independently.
And the network has uncovered some remarkable things, some of which Paul documents in the podcast. But for people who haven't yet had a chance to listen, maybe you could summarize a little bit about what it is that you found out doing this work.
I mean, I think there are two important things. You know, the first one is when Daphne was killed, before she was killed, she was working on many topics, but two very important ones. The first one, you know, she knew that there was an offshore company in Dubai called 17 Black. And, you know, she had the intuition that this company was created to, you know, send kickbacks to politicians. And, you know, she started to have information on that. And second thing is just, you know, in the weeks before she was killed, she received a massive leak from a public company called Ena Malta, which is, you know, an energy company in Malta, involved on the main public contract of the past years for the creation of an energy plant in Malta. And, you know, it was right before she was killed. And then what we realized after, and what we discovered after, which is the right word, is that the owner of this company, 17 Black, was Jürgen Fenech, who is the person today prosecuted for the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, that is suspected to be the mastermind, or at least one of the mastermind of her killing. That this company was supposed to send kickbacks to two other offshore companies belonging to the chief of staff of the previous prime minister and the energy minister of the previous government. So, you know, she had everything right, and that's perhaps one of the motives of her assassination. And these kickbacks were supposed to be made on the public contract of Ena Malta and the creation of this energy plant. So, you know, everything makes sense. And there is perhaps here a motive for a murder. And I think it would be the most terrible motive in a sense, because it's implicating, you know, people at the top level of the government. Jürgen Fenech is one of the most important businessman in Malta. There is Azeri money implicated in this deal as well, and we know that, you know, Azerbaijan is not necessarily a democracy. So I think there is, you know, geopolitical issue. There is corruption at top level of the government. She was pointing very sensitive issue, and that's perhaps the reason why she was killed.
Thank you so much for that, Jules. Forbidden Stories do incredible work. I would really recommend everybody go and find the website, read the articles from the Daphne Project, and indeed many other journalists who you're supporting and many other investigations that you're continuing with. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through that. I think we have Paul now, who has...
And hello, Paul.
You're old friends, right?
Yeah, we know each other well.
Paul, are you there? Hoping he's connecting. While we wait and hope for Paul to arrive, I'll just tell you a little bit about Paul. So he works for Tortoise, which is a UK-based slow news organisation that do amazing work. Paul has written about opioids in the UK, murder and money laundering in Latvia, bribery in Monaco, lobbying and sanctions in Washington, and the industry of non-disclosure agreements. And of course, he has been digging into the work of his mother, Daphne, and the background of her murder. In 2019, just last year, he won New Journalist of the Year at the British Journalism Awards. And he is, of course, the creator and the presenter of My Mother's Murder, which is a podcast by Tortoise, which I would highly recommend everyone listen to. Paul, are you there? Classic technical issues. As I understand it, Paul has been following up elements of Daphne's court case, or the investigation into her death today. So I think that's why he's been a little delayed. I will just check in. Hang on.
Hi.
Hi, Paul. Hello. Thank goodness.
Hi, I'm so sorry. My internet connection just dropped, but here I am.
No worries. It's the classic Zoom call that everyone is far too used to by now. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, my pleasure. Sorry,
We've been hearing from Jules about the amazing work of Forbidden Stories, taking up your mother's incredible investigations and proceeding with them. And would love to hear a bit from you about, I guess, specifically about the podcast, seeing as this is a podcasting festival. Maybe you could tell us when it was that you came up with the idea of turning this journey into a podcast, and why choose that as a medium rather than film or book or a long form article?
A good question. I suppose I'm a bit of a strange guest for a podcast festival, because this was my first podcast, first and only podcast. And the decision to do this as a podcast was made for me. So maybe what I'm about to say is more directed at people who haven't done podcasts or feel like it's not for them. Because that's actually what I thought. I thought I'd rather just write, which is what I'm used to. The decision was made, I think, around October. So before that really intense period Jules was just talking about. And I just didn't know where to start, you know? So one of my editors at Tortoise said, look, we really want to do this other podcast. I'm going to pair you up with an audio producer. So for people who are interested in doing something like that, that's the first thing I'd recommend is working very early on with an audio producer, because they think about things that a non-audio reporter wouldn't normally think about. I think the kind of audio you need to pick up, the way you interview people, where you go, that sort of thing. And the planning kind of started in London, and we were interviewing people there at first, because so many of the people involved in our campaign are based in London, so the NGOs, the lawyers. And then we made plans to go to Malta, and the really extraordinary thing is we picked actually a quiet week so that people would be available for interviews. And the date was, so the plan was to arrive on the 19th of November. And so we'd kind of fill the week with interviews. There was a little quote on nothing, no news we expected. So Gary, my audio producer, and I arrived that night, and then within a few hours, and again, Fennec, so the man who she was talking about, was arrested while trying to escape or trying to flee Malta. All these kind of pictures started coming into my phone of Jorgen Fenech's super yacht being raided out at sea, his yacht being brought back into his family's private marina. And it just really took from there. The podcast then took this shape of that day. So we started kind of in reverse. We started with the arrest of this man, and then kind of unwound the story of how we got to him.
Fantastically fortunate, I guess, that you happened to be there at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, and really not something I'm used to, being in the right place at the right time. But, you know, sometimes it happens. And then it was this very spacey, live feel.
Yeah, fantastic for the kind of narrative arc, if you will, of the podcast that you had. This.
Right. Yeah.
I was going to ask, how do you find and create scenes? Because that's a classic documentary making technique, right? You show, you don't tell, and that can be hard to plan for. But
yes,
it's a bit of luck.
Yeah, no. And you're right. And the kind of, you know, there are podcasts, there are good podcasts where, you know, you have a kind of host guest type discussion setting, you know, a series of interviews. And I thought initially that's what we'd end up with, you know, interspersed with us walking around Malta talking about the scene, because that's the nice thing about audio, you know, you can walk somewhere and talk about what you're looking at, and expressing a scene in audio is so much more efficient than doing it in words. So the kind of best example from the podcast Gary and I did, I think, are the protests in the last episode. So in this week, Malta just completely erupted. Protests day and night, multiple times a day. Outside Parliament, the Prime Minister's office. And we were there, you know, we were in the crowd, picking up the sound of people shouting, talking to protesters, actually participating in the protest. And I thought, how extraordinary. If I had to write this down, you know, how would I even do it? I'd have to kind of pull out a notepad in the middle of the protest, take down notes, you know, like a nut, and then go home and write it up. Whereas now we're just walking around with a microphone. And when you hear it in the last episode, I think it's just really moving, I think, hearing that live, you know, that protest.
Yeah, I think some of the beauty of podcasting can be how immersive it can feel as a listener, but also that sense of intimacy. And I think because we feel like we know you so well by that point, I think it's the final episode, there's even that moment where you talk about how you were so angry during the protest that your producer's trying to get you to talk and you just can't even vocalize it. Even as a really powerful.
He was super annoying, but very professional. Because you know, it's strange. If you report a story, let alone you're part of it, you're used to being alone. You know, you arrange your own appointments, you set up the interview how you. Suddenly, this producer with. Suddenly there's this producer with you putting a microphone in your face and reminding you to say stuff like, how are you feeling? What do you think? What are you looking at? And but it's good, you know, it's exactly. Hey, can you hear me?
Sorry, I think I just had a connection issue. I'm not sure if that was my end or yours. Are you back? Yes. Great.
Oh, it's faded out. But anyway, here I
No
am.
worries. Thank you. Yeah, no, and fantastic to get all of those scenes on tape. But I guess going even back a step, you know, when you started out on this process, it's in some ways a very complicated story, or there's a lot of detail, and you as someone so close to the story, and obviously, you know, so close to your mother and having a personal involvement in it, how do you sift through all those details and find the critical distance to know, you know, this is the thing we need to put in it, and this stuff is kind of extra information that wouldn't work in the podcast or isn't necessary to the core story?
Look, it's really difficult, you know, because reporting on any story like this would be hard. If you're talking about someone so close to you, then it's exhausting. And the difficulty for people who are used to doing written journalism, the difficulty with a audio project is that the editing process means you're in and out of a studio. You're saying the same thing in different ways, or something slightly different in the same way over and over again, and that can be really punishing if you have some emotional connection to the story. So it's unlike, say, sharing a Google Doc with your editor who makes some comments and then you send it back, which is there's some more distance. On the rest of, but there's no way. You just need a good editor, you need a good producer, you need them to respect that these things can be tiring. And for the rest of it, you go through that usual editorial process, you know, of accumulating some base of facts. A reporter tends to think everything they've uncovered or collected is important and interesting. So then an editor has to come along and tell you, actually no, we only need this much. But what I liked about working on a multi-part podcast is you have to be really disciplined in even how you write. So the parts you script in, so your sentences need to be short, your words very clear, the arc needs to be clear. You can't be lazy, I think, in a way that maybe in written journalism you can fall into being. And some, you know, you play it. When you play it, I think you have this sense that it's just not coming together.
Yeah, and you do a great job. I think there's even, I think it might be the second episode where you kind of say, wait, stop, that was all a bit complicated, you know, talking about shell companies and how they're connected, and you kind of go back and explain it again. And as a listener, I found that really helpful because, you know, as intimate as a podcast is, you might be listening to it while you're doing something else. And it's quite nice to have someone say, let's talk it through one more time.
Yes, no, thanks. And I think, yes, I mean, what we were able to do was really nice is get people to talk about the work they've done. So Juliette Garside, Stephen Gray, both members of the Daphne project, which Jules was talking about. So that I really enjoy, because you have people who did the work, you know, they were witnesses to it, talking about it in their words, how they got the story, what they thought of it. And that's quite a nice thing to do if you're able to do it.
Tell me about the decision to interview family members, specifically your brothers, as part of that, and what that was like, because I can't imagine trying to interview family members, never mind about something as traumatic as this.
Yeah, So the interview with Matthew was the one I was looking forward to least for obvious reasons. But then, how can you not? You know, he was the first one at the scene, was alone there for a while, and has been at the center of most of the campaigning to date. And I think with my brothers, for the past 3 years, the situation has been that we sort of did everything together anyway. So it felt unnatural to me in a kind of personal way not to speak to them for this podcast. It wouldn't have reflected reality, first of all, because again, we did all the work together. And it's just something I wanted to do. On the other part, so I interviewed my Aunt Cora, so my mother's sister, and my maternal grandparents as well. And that was to cover the sort of biographical part of it. So rather than have me drone on about my mother's childhood and adolescence and whatever else, the idea was to get them to do it. And after all, they're better witnesses because my aunt grew up with her, my grandparents raised her, so they are closer in a way to the facts. I guess it could have worked differently. I could have done it as a kind of memoir and say I remember my mother like this, but I don't know. It's just a question on what the nature of it is, and it was already difficult territory because I'm kind of reporting on my family. So this was, I guess, speaking to them also a way of making clear this isn't all me talking from memory and experience.
Yeah, and I think it's really nice as a listener to have different voices as well. It helps kind of move the story on in a way. And it was really lovely to have so much of your mother, Daphne's voice in there as well, using these audio, some of it public and some of it kind of private interviews that she had done. How did you come to that decision, and what was that like to find and include that? I think Paul might have frozen. I think he's having some connection issues at his end. We'll hope that he's back in a second. In the meantime, I can tell you if you have any questions for Paul, please do drop them in the Q&A box, which you should find at the bottom of your screen, and hopefully we'll have some time to go through some of those. Paul, are you there? Sorry about this, folks. The classic trying to do things on Zoom calls. It's been going well so far. Hopefully you've heard us thus far. Let's see if we can get him back. We'll just give him a minute to try and reconnect. In the meantime, if you haven't listened to My Mother's Murder, you can find it. It's by Tortoise, who have done several other different episodes. So it's not its kind of own podcast series. It's within their wider list of different episodes. 4 different episodes within that mini series. And I think it is a masterclass in storytelling, really.
Hi, I'm so sorry. It keeps dropping.
Not at all. I'm getting scared. It's at my end, but you can hear us okay now.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
No,
sorry, you were...
I was just asking about the decision to include your mother's voice in the podcast using recordings of.
Yeah, so that seemed, you can't. It was for obvious reasons we couldn't speak to the protagonist, so we started looking for interviews she gave, which was hard because she actually didn't give very many. She never liked kind of being the story herself, although that's really what ended up happening. And so we looked through a lot of archival material for interviews. Amazingly, we found that really old interview she gave, I don't know, mid-90s, I think, something like that, which was just amazing to hear her talk about when she started writing, what it was like. So that was a real kind of precious, at least for me, precious find. Another extraordinary thing was about 10 days before she was killed, a researcher from the Council of Europe had interviewed her, not for publication, just for her own research project. So it was an on-background interview. And she talked at length about the pressures she felt as a journalist, the difficulties she got started. So it was this incredible witness statement of her whole career. And my God, 10 days before she was killed. And had she not given that interview, there would have been so much we'd have never known about her. So we drew on that quite a lot. So that was really good.
Powerful to hear her voice.
Yeah, no.
A tricky question, but did you ever consider trying to interview any of the accused or any of the kind of higher politicians that are mentioned in it? That might be, if it wasn't your story as a journalist, you might say, well, I need to go and get their take on it.
Yeah, no, of course we did, and none of them wanted to. Yeah, they just weren't very interested, which is unfortunate, but then also understandable in a way from where they're standing. And things they may have agreed to it before Fenech was arrested, but like Jules was saying, that was a real turning point, not just in my mother's case, but in Maltese history, because so much has changed since then, and so much will continue to change. But once we passed that point, they were gone. Muscat, Schembri, they had nothing. They stopped caring, in short, about how the public saw them. That ship sailed. The fight became something else altogether for them. It became purely criminal. It wasn't a PR battle anymore.
Right, and as Jules explained, and as we heard before, it's an ongoing issue. Maybe before we go to, I mean, I could talk to you for days, but before we go to some other people's questions, my final question is, how do you know when to stop? How did you know this was going to be a 4-part series and then we put a full stop? Or are there going to be further episodes? Because there's continuations in the case, it seems, every day.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I made as a point you in saying that the decision for 4 episodes was totally arbitrary and not mine. And it could have been longer, maybe. I really feel it's a complete work now. It's a kind of, it's really how I felt, saw things at the time. And I hope it kind of gives a basis, provides a basis for other people to work on it. I think the story isn't, as Drew said, fading away. It's doing the almost opposite. Sorry, a car alarm has just gone off.
That's atmospheric tape. It takes a slow.
Yeah, this is what you want. Now my baby's crying in the background, so it's a crisis. So I think it's an amazing story, and I hope people keep working on it, because it's becoming increasingly dramatic, and we are nowhere near a resolution. So Fenech was arrested that week, but you know what? A jury trial is maybe 2 years away. And you could do a whole podcast about that single jury trial, right? So
did I read that you're writing a book with your brothers?
That's right. Unfortunately, not so much with my brothers, more alone, which is what happens when you're the youngest. But yes, so I've spent the most of the past year working on a book, which has been a difficult thing to do for the same reasons that the podcast was difficult, because it's, you end up in this bizarre situation where you're reporting on your mother, speaking to her school friends, speaking to her employers, her old editors, that kind of thing. But very good, very. I found it very moving, and the book will be out, I think, in October.
Oh wow! Okay, very soon. Fantastic.
Yeah,
incredible, incredible work, and the emotional.
That's very kind. Thank you.
No, it's amazing, and it's an amazing podcast. But I think we don't talk enough about the emotional toll generally of investigative journalism. Never mind when you have the kind of personal trauma that you've been facing as well. So to find a way through that is incredibly admirable. We have a few questions. If anybody has any more questions, drop them now in the Q&A. The first one was, Mike has asked, seeing as this was your first podcast, what was the one biggest thing you learnt about the podcast making process?
I think, if I, leaving aside the subject matter, and say you're someone like me who had no experience with your projects. That's really from there. It would be the main kind of foundational point. How do you producer with you from and work with?
I think we might have lost Paul again, but I think the answer he was saying was have a good producer, and I can definitely attest to that.
And say you're someone like me who, from day one, that kind of foundational point, take them with you wherever you go.
Great. So have somebody with a bit of critical distance and a second pair of ears, I guess, to help you sift through the details and find the storytelling threads.
That's right. Can you me? Okay, because my video seems to have stopped. I'm still okay. Yes, point is the main one, because they know what they're doing. They know the kind of sounds, field sounds, whatever you call them, you need to pick up. They know when an interview is sounding good. They know what to ask you to narrate parts of the podcast. So that is essential, I'd say.
We also have a question from Ivan, who asks, what do you think of the concept for embedded extreme journalism? Maybe Ivan can explain a bit further what it was he understands by that term. I know there's embedded journalists that work with kind of military occupiers and military organizations and things. But yeah.
I'm afraid I'm not sure what that means.
Yes, me neither. Ivan, if you can elaborate in the Q&A section, we can come back to that. But while we do, Paul, maybe you could talk a little bit about any safety protocol you had to put together when making the podcast.
Good question. So we agreed on with our editor on places where we couldn't go because they were too dangerous. So one place, for example, that would have been good to go to is where the 3 hitmen who've been charged with executing my mother sort of met and would discuss their plans in a very kind of deprived harbour town. So places like that were kept off limits for obvious reasons, but also because in my case, and because Malta is a small place, and because the campaigning has put me in the news, I'd be recognisable, and so nothing really good would have come of going to somewhere like that. So to be honest, because we thought we were going to Malta to just kind of meet people in offices or living rooms or whatever, we didn't, and we just kind of found ourselves thrown into these protests every day. But that's no model to follow.
Yeah, that's a hard one to plan for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Paul. We appreciate that you're incredibly busy and that this is a kind of ongoing process that you're living, and it can be something that potentially tricky to talk about. So we really appreciate your time today.
No, it's been my pleasure. Sorry, the internet connection hasn't been great.
That is but if people want to hear more of your dulcet tones, they can listen again, if they haven't yet, to My Mother's Murder, which is really, a fantastic testament to your work and to your mother's work.
That's very kind. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for listening. If anyone wants to ask a question by email, say, my email address is on my Twitter profile, so it's paul@tortoisemedia.com. With the proviso that I'm really not an expert in podcasts. I did this one. I learned a lot doing it, and I think they're great. I think they offer reporters a real lot of room in how they tell a story, and can give it real colour without kind of burning up hundreds or thousands of words. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It was great to have you with us, and special thanks to you as well. And of course, thank you, Maeve, for moderating this discussion. Unfortunately, the gods of the good internet weren't with us today, but that's the reality of having a virtual festival. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But please stay tuned, don't go anywhere, because we'll have just a brief 10-minute break, and then we'll be back with Maeve. And this time she will tell us the story of her own podcast. And trust me, she has a lot of interesting things to say. As Paul was saying, it's an interesting format to go behind the scenes and tell big investigative stories. And we're looking forward to the next session about the tip-off. So take a break, stretch your legs, and we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Hello again, and welcome back to day 3 of Listen Up, the Power of Podcasting. For the second part of this evening, we have Maeve McClenaghan again with us. I'm very excited to have her with us. For those of you who also joined us for the first part of the conversation, she did an excellent job interviewing Paul Caruana Galizia about his podcast, My Mother's Murder. And this is something that you usually probably see her doing in her own podcast called The Tip Off, which brings us behind the scenes of big investigative stories. She is an investigative reporter herself with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in the UK. And some of her work appeared in The Guardian. She did stories for BBC Radio, etc. And she's not just writing story dolls, she's looking for new ways to tell stories and have a very innovative approach to bringing stories about domestic violence to live audiences around the UK. And she's trying to do that as well with, again, her podcast, The Tip Off. But without further ado, I want to give the floor, or the Zoom in this case, to Maeve. And I'm looking forward to hearing more and learning more of how you do your podcast. So take it away.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. And welcome back to those who were in the previous session. Of course, the great thing about podcasting is you can go back and edit out all of the technical blips. Not quite the same with live presentations, but hopefully we'll get through this one okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own podcast and then talk you through some of the storytelling techniques and the elements of how to put investigative journalism into a podcast format. Kind of tips of the trade, I guess, that I have learnt and developed over the years. And we'll talk as well about some things to look out for when you're thinking about making these kind of podcasts. And we'll finish off with some recommendations. And indeed, if people have recommendations that they want to give, maybe you could put them in the chat at the end. But I guess I am an example of a podcaster from the kind of grassroots level. So as was mentioned, I'm an investigative journalist, and my day job is I work at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism here in the UK. But my podcast, The Tip Off, is completely independent, and it really was a labour of love, and came about because I think I had the idea, sat in a pub talking to friends one evening, and once I had the idea, I kind of just had to run with it. And the concept was, you know, the product, the end result of investigative journalism is always fascinating. What people present, what people find out is really, truly very interesting. But what else is really interesting is all of the work that goes into it behind the scenes. You know, I have a lot of friends who work as investigative journalists, and we would sit around and they would tell me about the time they were undercover and their wig slipped off and they had to, you know, panic and think of a way to cover it up, or the time they were trying to doorstep someone and they spotted that there was a garden gnome in the garden, and that was the clue that they needed to tell them this was the right person. You know, all of these behind the scenes colourful elements that wouldn't ever make it into a final story, but that I thought was really interesting. So once I had that idea, I decided I was just going to start making this podcast. I make it on my own. I have very basic equipment. I started using just a free software called Audacity and taught myself to edit. You can certainly hear that in the first couple of episodes. It's me making it up as I go along. And later on, I brought in some people to help me edit and make it sound a bit more professional. But that's all just to explain that you don't need a huge budget. You don't need a huge organization backing you to do podcasts. The beauty of the format is that they really are, you know, an equalizer. They let anybody tell their story, and if you have an interesting enough story to tell, then, you know, hopefully people will catch on and listen. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you all so we can go through a presentation, and I'm also going to try and play some audio clips. So fingers crossed this works. Let me go share computer sound. So hopefully now you can see my presentation. Let me just start this slideshow and we'll get going. So, as mentioned, my name is Maeve McClenaghan. You can find me on Twitter at MaveMCC, and my podcast is at Tip Off Podcast. So the Tip Off started a few years ago, and it has been a fantastic success. It's won some really nice awards. It's got some really lovely reviews, but it really is a fairly simple concept, which is that I sit down and I interview an investigative journalist, much like Caruana Galizia, and we talk about everything that went into their investigation, all of the kind of little elements of how they ran down the story, the issues they might have faced, the frustrations they might have faced along the way. And then I write a narrative kind of arc around that and edit it quite heavily to give the sense that we're on the journey with them, that you're kind of stood by their side as they're doing their detective work. So you can go back and listen to, I think we've got about 36 episodes out. And as well as being, I guess, an example of a podcast in itself, I also am really inspired every time I interview each of these investigative journalists to find out their tricks of the trade, how it was they found the story, how it was they navigated any of the complications that they might have found. And every single time I talk to somebody, I learn something new that I can then use in my own journalism and take with me. So it's kind of a learning material as much as it is a fun podcast as well. So do have a listen if you need some inspiration for how to find and develop your investigations. So if you yourselves are thinking of making a podcast that involves investigative journalism, obviously the first step is finding your investigation, which is easier said than done. Some of you might already be journalists, some might not, but an investigation generally starts with a hypothesis, which is a question that you want to test, that you want to dig into and find the answer for. So you don't start out knowing what you're going to find, which is why investigative journalism is long and tedious and expensive in some cases, because it doesn't always work. You might work for months on something and never find an answer, or it turns out that there isn't a story. But sometimes you do, or you find something else out. So you start with your hypothesis, and I often come across mine by, sometimes it's by reading the news and almost reading in between the lines of stories and thinking, what isn't being said here? Or how did this come to be? Or, what's going on behind the scenes that we got to this point? So that can help draw things out. Or it might be talking to sources and they bring you something. In some cases, you might get a fantastic leaked document or, a huge data dump like the Panama Papers, but those are few and far between often. More often than not, it's you kind of having a hunch about something and deciding to follow the trail. I would also say, if you're thinking of making an investigative podcast, it needs to be something that you're really passionate about, because it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. And if you lose interest in the subject halfway through, it's going to be a really tedious job, and that's probably going to translate into how you tell the story. So if you really are interested and fascinated in your topic, even if 95% of what you find out doesn't make it into your final product, that's going to reflect in the way that you tell your story. It's also important to, think about, is this interesting to others? You might be hugely passionate to do an investigation into whatever, you know, the wildlife in your garden, but are other people really going to care about that? So you know, you might want to canvass some opinions and say, you know, is this something that people are going to listen to? Is it worth your while putting all this information out there? And, you know, there are a lot of podcasts around today. Don't let that put you off, but maybe do some solid research into what else is out there. Has somebody already covered this subject thoroughly? Is there anything more that you can add to it? Or are you going to spend all this time doing work that actually, it turns out, everybody already knows and has been listening to already? And then finally, when thinking about subject, it's worth thinking about, is a podcast the best medium for it? There are some fantastic investigations, really complicated ones. You know, I might argue that the Panama Papers is an example of, you know, they found a lot of really complicated, interesting stuff, shell companies all attached to each other. But a podcast might not be the best way to explain that, the best way to get that story across, because you might need visuals, you might need to lay the data out in a graph, or you might just need a written piece where the reader can go back and remind themselves who it is you're talking about. You know, if you have a lot of figures, I think somebody once told me, in a half-hour radio piece, you shouldn't have more than 3 figures in it, like 3 bits of data in it, because as a listener, you just can't take it in. If you're saying there was a 52% increase and this number and £5 million and etc., you're just going to lose people. And the great thing about podcasting is, you know, it's a really intimate experience of listening. People are, you know, carrying your voice around in their ears, but at the same time, they might be doing the dishes, they might be picking the kids up from school, they might be driving. So anything too granular and complex might not work for a podcast. You might find a way to do it, but that's just something to think about. Now, I couldn't possibly train you on how to do an investigation in an hour or a week or probably a month, but some techniques you might use are things like freedom of information requests, if those exist in your country. We're very fortunate in the UK in that lots of government public bodies have to give over information if you ask for it in the right way. They often find excuses not to, but that can be a way to get your information. You might use public data that is already out there. There's some amazing open source investigations that use databases that exist, or Google Maps, or any kind of public data to find stories and to dig into stories. And there's some examples in the tip-off of people doing that. And you might want to look at resources by places like the Global Network of Investigative Journalists and the Knight Centre do some amazing online courses where you can learn a little bit about some of those techniques. Another classic one, of course, is doing interviews and just talking to sources. And that's quite, you know, the classic way of doing investigative journalism, but finding those sources can be something in itself. You might need to use social media, find their Facebook profile, find their Twitter handle. You might need to use LinkedIn or something similar to find them online to make that initial approach. You might use public reports or create your own timelines. You know, sometimes, for example, you know, in the story that Paul was talking about, my mother's murder, there's a lot of things that happen over a period of time. And to keep track of that, if you plot it in a timeline, you might notice that Jorgen Fenech pops up here and here and here and here, where you might not have noticed that if you weren't looking at it in a kind of linear way. And you might want to familiarize yourself with reading accounts and company official reports to find out what they're saying and what's hidden in the small print. Someone once told me, when looking at company accounts, start at the end and read backwards, because it's always the little bits that they put in the kind of side notes where they hope that nobody has bothered to continue reading, where the real juicy details are. So once you've got your idea for your investigation, there's certain things you're going to want to think about in terms of the format of telling that. Are you going to make a one-off documentary? You might think, you know, this is really solid, I'll tell it in one story and that will be it. Or is it going to be a serialized drama? I would warn, I think if you're going to serialize it, and there's fantastic examples of people doing really great serialized investigations, but you have to make sure that the story warrants it. So I've listened to some podcasts that have made it into a 10-part series, and I've listened and thought this could have been done in 2 episodes, in 3 episodes. They're really dragging it out now, and that can be quite tedious and turn listeners off. So, you know, how many parts are you going to do? My Mother's Murder is a really interesting example, just 4 parts, and there's a huge amount, like Paul was saying, you could have gone on and done more, but that is enough to tell the crux of the story, and it keeps you engaged, and it makes sure that the important points come across. So, and how long are your episodes going to be? Interestingly, I never really set out with a time limit when I am making the tip-off, but they seem to naturally happen to be about 30 minutes when I come to write my scripts and edit them down. And I think that's just because, for my personal taste and my ear, that's about the length of time that I concentrate for. It gives me space to tell a story, but it's not so long that I am getting bored and labouring the point. Now, there are other examples of fantastic hour-long episodes. There's also some really interesting podcasts, I think, that do little 5-minute snippets and 10-minute snips of things. So you're going to want to consider what kind of length you're doing. And if you are doing a series of episodes, are they all going to be the same length so the listener kind of comes to expect it? Or are you going to have shorter episodes and then longer episodes? Lots of decisions to be made. Is there going to be a kind of narrator scripted tone? Or will it be 2 people in a room having a discussion? You know, there's lots of podcasts like that. Some people like that idea of listening in to 2 friends having a chat. You might want to do that, or you might want to do something a bit more structured and almost kind of a dramatic element to it. And do you have a satisfying conclusion to your investigation? I'm not saying you need that to do a good investigative podcast, but there are some examples out there that start off and then never come to a kind of conclusive ending. And that can be quite frustrating. And it can sometimes be ethically and legally tricky as well. You know, if you're setting off on a strand of investigation and you don't know where you're going, and you don't know that the wrong-uns that you're talking about are wrong-uns, you know, that's not necessarily ethical to put that out there and to raise a load of questions and kick up dust about people. Doesn't quite fall into that category, but for example, the very first series of Serial, which I think was most people's introduction to podcasts, me included, and certainly to investigative podcasts, raised a lot of questions but didn't have a definitive conclusion. And you might feel that that left you wanting as a listener, or you might think, do you know what, it doesn't matter, they asked questions, that was the important thing. So that's something to consider. I'm not going to talk about the kit that I use or the technicalities because I'm not an expert in that, but there is a Facebook page called Podcasters Support Group, which is set up by Helen Zaltzman, who does The Illusionist and other podcasts. And it's a place where lots of people go and have asked questions about what's the best kit to use. And so they have some documents, kind of pinned documents that talk you through here's how you record over Zoom or Skype, here's the best reporter's mic, etc., etc. So that's I'll send you guys there to look at that. Okay, so you've got your idea for your investigation. You've got a sense of the structure, the format you're going to use. Now you might want to think about the tone of the piece. Are you going to really dive in and tell a beautifully rich, detailed story like S-Town or Shit-Town did and was renowned for doing? Might you use different interviews with people to really make it feel human and personal? And that requires getting incredible access to your protagonists. So Dirty John, I think, is an example of that. It was started as an LA Times long read magazine piece, newspaper piece, but then developed into a podcast because they had access to these women who had been tricked by this man, Dirty John. And so, you know, that the podcast gives a really human element of that. Is there going to be a personal journey like My Mother's Murder? Or is it going to be more detached and factual like The Daily, which is the New York Times's, daily podcast? Or, you know, investigations don't have to be into huge corruption or murders or terrible wrongdoings. They can also be an investigative element of something lighter. You know, your favorite ice cream might have been discontinued and you decide you're going to set out and find out whatever happened to your ice cream or similar. And I'm going to try and play you a clip from The Mystery Show, which was a podcast made by Starlee Klein, an American journalist and podcaster. And she basically set off on a series of strange little investigations. Things like, what is the actor Jake Gyllenhaal's real height? You know, not hard-hitting Pulitzer Prize-winning investigations, but the way that she framed it and the way that she wrote her script was in a kind of film noir, gumshoe journalist detective story that gave it quite a nice whimsical feel. So let me play you a little bit of this and hopefully it will play for you. So she's talking about somebody has found a belt buckle on the street and have asked her to find out who it belonged to.
I would find Hans Jordy and return his buckle to him, even though this case made my stomach hurt a little. The buckle was that rarest of things, an object as enchanting in actuality as it was as a story. What were the chances that the real-life Hans Jordy and the real-life Bob Six would be that too? I wasn't in the preserving whimsy and wonder business, though. I was in the mystery-solving business, and I had my work cut out for me. There were so many gaps to fill in. For example, I already knew Hans's position on miniature toasters, but nothing at all about how he felt about regular-sized ones.
So, there we go. Setting up that she's going out on this investigation, but, you know, it's not serious. It's whimsical, it's light in tone, but she's written a script in such a way that it still draws you in and you care about something as potentially anodyne as finding out who owns this belt buckle. You're going to also want to think about structure of your podcast. That relates to each episode as much as to the whole series structure. So I try and think of each episode and the series in 3 acts. So you start out with a question, with a hypothesis, with a problem. You then go on a journey in the 2nd act, and then the 3rd act is the resolution. And thinking like that in quite a kind of dramatic narrative way can keep you from wandering off into too many directions, can keep your listener really engaged, because there's a kind of trust that you know where the story's going somewhere. You're not just listening to the random ramblings of somebody. It actually has a point. You might decide that one way to do that is to find a protagonist whose journey you can follow. I'm going to play you another clip now, which is from an American show called Embedded. This was an episode about the opioid crisis in the USA. And it's talking about something fairly nebulous, a very big kind of societal issue. And you could just talk about it that way. But what the host does, or the podcast team do, is find individuals that can, through which they can tell that story. So they come across a couple whose child has been taken into care, both of whom are suffering with addiction issues. And through those protagonists, we learn a little bit more about the opioid crisis and its impact in a way that just talking about it wouldn't get across. So we'll have a quick listen to this.
I mean, I really don't like talking about my kids. It's just too hard for me.
He doesn't want to talk about the kids, but he will say that in order to get them back, he has to be clean. The mother of the kids, Samantha, she's already clean because she's in jail. She was arrested on prostitution charges and pleaded guilty.
And she's getting out, right?
Devin says she gets out in a few days.
I've got to change my ways right now in the next week before she gets out, because she's been so unclean for 5 or 6 months now, and she's not wanting to come back here to this place. So
She gets it that she's like, I can't. She knows that if she comes here, that it'll be an influence. So you're going to try to get clean before she comes out?
So there you go. Rather than talking about this in a kind of big picture way, you go on a journey with those people. Another classic documentary method is that you show, you don't tell. So rather than, they're embedded, rather than them saying opioid addiction affects lots of families, and occasionally it can have impacts on children, etc. They don't have to spell it out to you, because you learn it through these characters and through what's happening to them. In the same way, you might, and this is the beauty of audio and podcasting, you can use atmospheric tape, so recordings of your environment, to help position the listener where you are. So, you're at a protest, you're at a riot, and you can hear people shouting and screaming. So you, as the presenter, don't have to say, people were shouting and screaming, fireworks were going off. You can let the listener fill in the blanks and tell the story themselves, which is a really good tip, I think, is to not patronize your listeners. Give them a chance to fill in the gaps and to feel like they're part of the storytelling technique. You might drop straight into the action, or you might give a kind of introduction. I'll come back to twists, because that's another section I'm going to play. You might decide in your structure that, if you're doing lots of episodes, you'll have set segments. So, for example, Reply All is another lots of my examples are US based, which shows I listen to too many American podcasts. But Reply All, for example, have a section called Yes, Yes, No. It's a technology podcast where they talk about, do you understand this meme or this tweet? And that can happen in lots of episodes. Heavyweight is another show which starts with a phone call to his best friend in each episode. And it gives a kind of structure to your series, but it also takes some of the legwork off you when you're writing it, because okay, halfway through we do this bit every time. And in structure, you can use twists in a narrative. So you might not start at the beginning of the story and work linearly through to the end. You might drop in at a certain place, loop back, go back to the beginning, and then carry on through. And I've done that in some examples of the tip-off. It helps to get the listener hooked in immediately. And Criminal, which is one of my favourite shows, does this brilliantly. You can be listening for a good 5 minutes before you know what each episode is about. And I'm going to play you this, which is the start of one of my favorites, which I think is a really good example of this.
I've never been a criminal of sorts, you know. I've just I've found a way to challenge law, if you like.
This is Mark Roberts. You may never have heard of him, but his name and his face are well known to law enforcement all over England.
Before every major event, they have a big speech about what to look out for, and I come up every single time. A big picture of me on screen. Everyone's given a picture of me to look out for me.
You know, I'm looking at your Wikipedia page right now.
I don't know who wrote that. It certainly wasn't me, and a lot of it's not true.
But there is this naked picture of you.
Yeah. Oh, that's definitely me then.
Mark.
I'll stop that there. But as you can see, it goes on. So that introduction carries on for quite a bit, and you as a listener are listening and thinking, what on earth is happening? Are they talking to, you know, is this guy a terrorist? Is he a prolific pickpocket? What, you know, how is he a criminal? And it's only at the end of that whole introduction, about 5 minutes in, that it's revealed that he is almost a professional streaker. So he goes to different sporting events, takes off all his clothes and runs onto the pitch. And as he was saying, he's so well known in that industry that the security guards across the world are poised to look out for him. Now, you could have started that episode by saying, today we're going to talk to a prolific streaker, you know, and that's interesting. But I think by doing it like that, by setting it up, it really hooks you as a listener. And, you know, it made me kind of stop in the street as I was listening and go, that's ridiculous, and made me remember it. So are there ways that you can twist what you think the listener is assuming, and kind of use those assumptions to your advantage? Okay, so structure done. When you're coming to record, you know, you're going to have to think about booking your guests, working out which voices you need to tell a story. You might not end up using all of those interviews, and you should be quite selective about what really worked, who really spoke to the issues you were talking to. You might think about where you're going to record. Sometimes, you know, if it's a complicated, serious interview, being somewhere like a studio or somewhere quiet where you can do the recording is important, because the listener is going to need to concentrate on what you're saying. And if they can hear cars going by, or in my case, my baby crying downstairs, that might put you off. Or is it better to be out in the field and somewhere atmospheric that actually adds to the interview and the recording? I won't play it, but I was going to play an example of a guy, Adam Buxton, going around an art gallery and talking to his interviewee about what they're seeing. And it doesn't matter that you can hear their footsteps, and it doesn't matter that you can hear people bustling in the background, because that's the whole point, is you're there with them. But if that went on for 30 minutes and they were talking about something serious, the ear might start to get tired and you might turn off. So think about that. You know, doing a good investigative interview is a skill in itself, and it's something you're going to learn as you go along. But you're going to want to think carefully about how you plan your questions. You know, do you go in aggressively at the start if you're challenging somebody? Are you trying to tease out information that you don't have? Or are you trying to pin them down and get them to kind of say something that will put them in the frame for it? So, you know, plan your questions accordingly. You might want to start softly and then get more serious, or you might want to get straight to the point. Some people might say they want to, you know, see the questions beforehand, and that's a decision you have to make. Are you going to give them prior warning, prior knowledge? I don't. And the reason I don't is not always because I'm trying to trip someone up. That's not always the case, but you don't want people, or I don't want people to sound rehearsed when they're giving their answers. And sometimes, you know, if you've given them what you're going to ask, you might get the kind of press office response, PR response, where they're almost reading from a piece of paper and you can hear it in their voice. So sometimes them thinking as they're talking is a nicer way to listen to it. Think about the ways, like we said, you're going to find the colour, you're going to paint the picture of this. So here in the UK, I think we're not great sometimes at storytelling. People go straight to the point. My American friends tell a much better story, in my opinion. And that's because often they talk in, this is a huge generalization, but often they talk in first person continuous tense. So they might say, so I'm walking down the street and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I need to get home. And then I hear this sound and I'm like, what's going on? Whereas a Brit might say, I was walking in the street and I heard a sound. And it's a little bit more kind of cold and whatever. So when I'm asking questions of my interviewees, I'm trying as much to go back and go over as many times as I need to say, okay, but tell me again, but tell me what's going through your head as you're stood on that doorstep about to knock and confront this person. What are you thinking? What's the weather like? What had you done? Just, you know, how had you arrived at that interview? What was going through your mind? Were you having a good day? Were you thinking about what you were going to have for tea? You know, help us to get into that moment and paint that picture for us. And that can mean you go over and over the same question again and again, and people might get a bit confused and think, I think I told you this, but you're, with your producer ear, trying to listen so that they're telling you, you know, enough detail that as a listener you feel like you're there in the moment with them. And that can be really important for investigations because there can be a lot of dry detail and you kind of really want to get people in and feeling the drama of what's happening and get them really engaged with the minutiae of every single moment. And like I said before, you know, you can use atmospheric tape to do that as well. Sometimes you might go back and, you know, you might not have been able to record enough at that moment. You might go back and record some noise of the traffic sound or the train station, whatever it might be afterwards. Or, you know, I've worked on podcasts before where my producers have told me the moment you step out of your hotel room, set your microphone running and keep it running. And so, you know, you hear me getting into the taxi and shutting the door. You hear me fumbling for my change. You know, we might end up not using any of that, but it might just be that you need to use a few little clips like that that you decide to tell the story of on the way in the taxi, I was worried, and, you know, you have the atmospheric tape to do that. Here's me ringing the doorbell. I then have to make sure that I let people know that I'm recording. So I ring the doorbell and as soon as they answer, I say, hello, hi, Maeve, I'm here to talk to you about this. I have got my microphone running. I'll stop that if you want, or is it okay, we'll just keep going, to be free and open, unless you decide you're doing undercover and you feel like you have enough legal prima facie evidence and legal understanding and backing to do that safely. Otherwise, it's better to be upfront and to tell people you're recording when you're recording. And then, you know, if you're going to do interviews, are you going to have several people in the room while you do the interview, or is it going to be one-to-one? Some things to think about. We've talked a little bit about the journey, the kind of story arc, but that's something that might come out in the scripting. So you've gone out, you've collected all this tape. You might have, I try to transcribe it all. I try to make notes, especially if I'm going out and hitting record when I leave my hotel room and leave my recorder running for hours. I try to take notes that, about 2 hours in, that's when I rang the doorbell. Or about halfway through the interview, they said something really interesting. I'm going to make a note now so that later when I have hours or days of tape, I can remember the one thing I know that this person told me, and I have it here in my notebook, is around halfway through the interview. So I'll go back and find it that way. So you have all of this wealth of detail, and then you want to be quite brutal, I guess, when it comes to editing it down and thinking, what are the 3 acts I'm going to tell? What is the journey we're going on? How am I going to get this narrative arc out? And sometimes, there will be natural moments of tension. And if you listen to the tip-off, you'll hear those, people describing them. And sometimes you might need to ramp them up a bit, and you might hear that, for example, in the tip-off, I sometimes talk to journalists who have done freedom of information requests. And that can be sending off an email and waiting for it to come back. Now, I can make that sound a bit more dramatic in the scripting and the editing by writing something like, they sent off the email. Would it be answered? When would they get their information? They waited and waited. And then finally, here, you can write your script to kind of ramp up the drama a little bit in that way. You might use music to do that as well. I tend to look for a kind of rhythm in the edit. And sometimes that can be visual. So you'll have your own way of editing the story, but I have different lines in Audacity or whatever program you're running. Here's my narration, here's interviewer 1, here's interviewer 2, etc. And I can even see visually that I talk for way too long here, and then it cuts to them for a tiny bit and then way too long. Or it's gone too staccato. So it's gone, I talk, they talk, I talk, they talk, I talk. And the rhythm of that might feel off to you. I think that the best thing I can say on that is immerse yourself in podcasts. Listen to as many as you can, and your ear will start to pick up what the rhythm feels like, where you think things, you might start noticing it now, like, oh, it's really starting to drag here. Or I feel like I've heard this person's voice for a really long time and I'm starting to switch off. And then apply that to your own episodes. And it's something I do, is try and listen to it over and over again and try and hear those moments where I've been talking way too long, or this person's been talking way too long and I need to interject or paraphrase what they're saying. I think you had somebody from Radiolab in, but something that they do amazingly is what I've heard somebody call trample the tape. I'll play an example of this because it's easier to hear than it is to explain, but it's that really Radiolab style that they have of really kind of quick interjections between the hosts and the interviewees. So we'll listen to a little clip. It doesn't really matter what they're talking about. It's a kind of science experiment, I think, about listening of how plants grow. But just listen to how they have spliced the interviewer, Robert Krowich, I think I'm saying his name right, the host, with the interviewee. And take a listen. Here we go.
Monica thought about that and designed a different experiment.
Again, if you imagine the pot, my experimental pot.
With the forked bottom.
Yeah, but then have
2 very different options for our plant. On one side, instead of the pipe with water, she attaches an MP3 player with a little speaker playing a recording of
the sound of water.
And then on the other side, Monica has another MP3 player with a speaker, but this one plays
nothing.
So she's got her plants in the pot.
So there we go. Don't need to go much further with that, but you get the idea. They didn't go to Monica and say, "Can you just say nothing? Can you just say the plant pot?" She did that interview. She spoke at length, I'm sure, and then they went back and they wrote their script around it. And Robert's voice interjects here and interjects there, and it's a way of livening up the interview, I guess. For me as a listener, it really keeps my ear engaged. Sometimes it can be done too much. My partner isn't a fan of it. He's sometimes like, it's giving me a headache to hear so many different voices. Just tell me the story. But it can be a way that you think, let's get this a bit more engaging. And sometimes if you've done a really important interview, but somebody has maybe delivered it in a slightly monotone way, or they haven't kind of imbued the right sense of urgency to it, you could use that kind of technique to make sure their voice is still included, but you're helping to write around what they're saying to liven it up a bit. You might decide to use music or special effects. I talked a bit earlier about using, stories with a lot of data, a lot of facts and figures in, or figures particularly, can be hard to tell. You might think about sonification of data. Reveal, which is another US podcast, did an example of this, which I will play you because I just think it's really interesting. It takes a lot of, probably a lot of time and resources, but it's a way of kind of using musicality to present big data. Sorry, not big data, to present data in a way, rather than explaining it, you kind of let it tell its own story. So I hope I had this one. Yeah, this is Reveal talking about earthquakes in, I think it's in California, and they make this bit of music, which is every time in a kind of timeline, every time there is an earthquake, you hear a tone, and they explain this in it, depending on how high or how low that tone is, depends on how big the earthquake was. And well, just listen and see what you deduce from this bit of music about the frequency and the seriousness of earthquakes over time. That obviously took a lot of work to do, but what have I done? But it, they were making the point about the frequency of earthquakes becoming, more and more frequent in California, then becoming more serious over that time. And by doing it that way, it kind of resonates with you as a listener in a way that you just saying that might not do. So I went away from that thinking, oh crumbs, something is happening with the, fault lines or whatever it might be, fracking or whatever it might be, that is causing this increase in tremors. And that's quite worrying. And that stuck with me in a way that me just telling you that wouldn't have. Another really practical point when scripting is if you are going to try and get sponsorship or ads, you might want to write in the ad breaks. Something I didn't do at the start of my series of The Tip Off because I didn't expect it to be as popular as it was and to get sponsors and ads. But it means that then I was just dropping ad breaks into random moments. Whereas now I try and either say something like more after this or just leave a little pause here or there where I know this is a sensible place where coming out of the story to have an advert wouldn't be too disruptive, and then go back in. And you might want to think about, are you going to try and present it with a natural voice, or is it going to be more poetic? So are you going to read from your script, which has every single word that you're going to say lined up, or are you going to try and just have the bullet points and maybe just talk naturally? So someone like Ira Glass at This American Life has that real kind of natural voice. I think they script quite heavily, and I think he knows what he's going to say, but he's such a professional that it sounds like him just saying, oh, here we are in my room and I'm having a chat. But as somebody new to podcasting, you might find that harder to do. So you might instead want to just think, these are the points I'm going to get across, and I'll try and just chat about it. Or you might think, I really need to make sure that, maybe this is legally sensitive. Maybe it's really complicated and I need to write out precisely what it is I'm going to say, or else I might get in trouble. And then obviously with investigations, you need to think about safety. So are your sources that you're including all protected? That might be people who, you quote or interview in the podcast, or people behind the scenes. Could it be that they get into trouble by telling you what they've told you, and how are you going to mitigate that? And are they aware of those issues? So, if a source, a whistleblower, for example, comes to me, I need to make sure that they followed the protocol in their organization. That means that they're protected. So that might mean that they need to raise their concerns with their line managers first, and try and pursue the normal complaints channels. And then if they come to me after that, they have more protection legally than if they just kind of come to me as the initial issue. If they're sharing documents, have they shared them in a safe way? Are we using PGP or some kind of encryption software, Signal or Proton Mail or something to share the documents? Is there any way that it can be traced back to their own computers, their work computers, their IP addresses, whatever it might be, the printers? I think, I can't remember who it was, but there was some case where one organization published a visual off a printout that had been given, and the organization was able to tell, because of something about the printer, who it must have been, and that person then got in trouble. So you can't be too cautious when it comes to source protection, and you have to be completely honest with your sources, and they have to be aware that that there might be consequences to them talking to you. If you're going to anonymize them, and you tell them you're going to anonymize them, how are you going to do that? So I did a podcast about women fleeing domestic violence, and decided that, even though these women, some of them wanted to tell their story, and they said, can we just change our names? And I thought, what, if it were me and it was my, if I was listening to somebody I knew very well, and even though they'd changed their names, I might still think, hang on, that's X person talking, and you might still be able to identify them even if they don't think they're identifiable. And who knows, you might hear the train announcer in the background, or some bit of information that gives away their location. You've got to think about those things. What is this as anonymous as it could be? Is it safer maybe to get an actor to read their testimony or their script? Or is it not so serious that you could just change their name and that would be safe enough? Your reporting, I don't know how many of you are journalists, but those of you that are out there, you know that you need to be fair and balanced. You don't want to just pick out the bits of information that agree with your hypothesis. You're trying to challenge it. You're almost trying to disprove it, because if you find that you can't, then you know that you've really got something good. In your reporting, are you making sure that you tell both sides of that story as much as is fair and is necessary? And have you gone to everybody that you are accusing and given them the chance to talk and tell their story? That's really important, not just because it protects you to an extent legally, and it makes sure that you're balanced, but it's also really practical, because they might tell you, actually, you completely misunderstood this bit of information, your story is wrong, and you want to test that and make sure they're not just spinning you a line. But right of replies are a chance for you to correct yourself as well, and make sure that you're not putting out something that could get you sued, that could get you sent to prison, that could get you in trouble. Investigative journalism is tricky and complicated, and you need, and this is why I made the tip off, because you need every point to be accurate, and we're getting one thing wrong, even if it's something quite simple, can undermine all of the bigger points of the story that you're trying to make. So part of my doing the tip off and having investigative journalists tell their stories is to try and get across just how hard people work to get the tiny bullet point in the 50th paragraph of each article absolutely accurate. So you need to do the same in your podcast, because you get one thing wrong, people are going to switch off, or worse, you're going to get into real trouble. And, ideally, like I say, I make my podcast independently. And that's because I'm talking to journalists who have already gone through the kind of editorial oversight elements of their investigations. They've had somebody fact check it thoroughly. They've had somebody, decide what are the risks, the legal risks, what can we say, how far can we push it, what can't we say. And that gives a sense of protection to me, because I know that I'm not going beyond that. But if I were doing my own investigative stuff, which, I have done and I will do, it is helpful or vital sometimes to have an editor, not just to tell you what's interesting and what's not, and where you've gone down a rabbit hole that no one else cares about, but also to say, this is too dangerous to say, or you can say this and we will protect you, and if you get sued, we'll take on the legal costs and fight your battles, rather than you doing it alone. So that's something else to think about. And then finally, I think before we go to questions, we're running out of time, just some suggested listening. Again, lots of US ones. I would love to hear about some European examples. But my favorite investigative podcast is called In the Dark. Their second series is an incredible masterclass, I think, in one, doing an investigation, and two, telling it. You really go on a journey with them. It's about looking into a man who was convicted of multiple murders. And while there's lots of cold case investigations out there that don't really go anywhere, this one has incredible impact, and they basically exonerate this guy and get him off a life sentence. Sorry, spoiler alert, but it's worth listening to just to find that out. Slow Burn is a great series. Caliphate has come into question recently with some of the questions around how much they rely on one particular source and how much you can trust him. But it's interesting in terms of storytelling. Serial, obviously. I loved the first series of Serial. Some of the subsequent series I found sometimes a little bit too much detail and too complex to follow. That's just my personal opinion. Catch and Kill podcast by Ronan Farrow, and of course The Tip Off, which I would love you all to listen to, and is available on Acast and iTunes and others. So thank you so much. I appreciate that was quite a lot of looking at my screen. I'm going to try and turn screen sharing off now. So how do I do that? Okay, maybe you can come back to me. So yes, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Maeve. This was a great crash course for those interested of starting their own podcast, and of course telling investigative stories through audio. Because we're almost out of time, even though I can keep asking you questions for another hour, I just wanted to touch on something. You mentioned that in the US, this is a genre that is used by investigative journalists. For example, you played a clip from The Reveal. They have been doing investigations for quite a while, using audio. Of course, we all know about Serial. Do you think we'll see more investigative podcasts in Europe as well?
Yeah, I really hope so. I think the US is a bit advanced in its model, so I think it's found a way to monetize podcasts in a way that maybe the European markets need to develop. And that can be a huge thing, especially with investigations. In the Dark, that example that I gave, my favorite one, they all moved to think it's Mississippi, and stayed there for a year to report, and that takes a huge amount of funding, and you know, you need to have somebody to back that and to follow it up. But I think the US model has shown just how engaging and interesting they can be. The New York Times' daily podcast, you know, isn't always investigative journalism, but I think has brought a lot of readers, a lot of subscribers to the New York Times, and has shown the benefits of what doing that, you know, how you can reach new audiences and reach them in different ways. So I'm really hopeful that the European model will continue. And please, people, do let me know if you hear of great European ones. My language skills aren't too developed, but if there's any English or Spanish language ones, I would love to hear.
And what is, I don't know, one big takeaway you could offer from doing investigative podcasts yourself? I mean, you mentioned the domestic violence story, etc.
I think it is, it's a really beautiful medium to tell intimate stories in a really interesting way. And you can get access that you might not get with a film camera, for example. People tell you things if you have a microphone, and they sometimes forget about the microphone, or they don't feel as intimidated as if they're on camera. But you can set the scene in a much easier and sometimes more engaging way than you can in a written piece. So I think it's a really nice balance of storytelling, but intimacy, but kind of ease of access, and I guess democratization as well of who gets to tell stories. You know, you don't have to, I did talk about the benefits of having an editor, but you don't have to pitch to an organization to tell it. And that means that we hear stories that old white middle class male editors might not think are interesting, because people just have the means to tell their own stories, and so we hear different voices, and I think that's really positive for investigative journalism.
And I think that's actually a pretty good end to this session, seeing podcasts as a democratizing platform which could offer us a diversity of voices. And you mentioned this in your presentation as well, but it's also, it could be an affordable way to tell untold stories, basically. And we as journalists increasingly see that, you know, those are everywhere, basically. Well, thank you so much, Maeve, for joining us tonight. It was a quite useful presentation, and I'm sure you've inspired some people maybe to take on podcasting. Thank you for those of you who joined us tonight, and don't miss out to join us tomorrow. You'll be in good company again. Tomorrow we'll showcase some very interesting podcasts in Central and Eastern Europe. We'll talk about something that Maeve just touched on, and she will be one of the panelists. We'll talk about the importance of female voices in podcasting and hearing this diversity of viewpoints. And we'll also learn about the incredible journey of Radio Ambulante. This is the only Spanish language podcast that's part of the NPR's network, and it's being broadcasted by them. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting Saturday if you decide to spend it with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.